Hi, my name is Larry Jordan, and welcome to this Power Up webinar taking a look at the new features inside Apple Compressor 4.1. In this excerpt, I present the basics of video compression, file size, and image quality. My goal for today is to provide an understanding of compression terms and how compression works. I want to showcase the new interface and some essential features of the 4.1 release of Apple Compressor. The reason that we compress our files is that an uncompressed 1080p file requires about 237 megabytes per second for playback. Now, this far exceeds any internet connection speed that mere mortals can afford. In fact, most compressed movies play back from the web at less than 1.5 megabytes per second. That's less than 1% of the original size and speed of the source file. Which brings me to compression rule number 1. When you compress, which is also called encoding, when you compress a file to make it smaller, you are always, absolutely, and irretrievably throwing away data which cannot be recovered at some point in the future. Therefore, you want to compress your file as few times as possible to preserve as much data as possible. And never recompress a compressed file. It only looks worse. Transcoding a file to a higher quality format, for instance going from AVC HD to ProRes, does not involve data loss, at least not to the same degree. And the easiest way to explain this is with what I call the bucket analogy. When you pour a full bucket of water into a bathtub, all the water will safely transfer from the bucket to the tub because the tub is big enough to hold all the water. Now, this assumes that we're sober enough to actually hit the bathtub. But generally, pouring water from something small into something big does not cause a problem, nor does it cause any loss. But if we pour a full bathtub of water into a bucket, not all the water fits. Most of it spills over the sides, and we'll lose more of the water than we keep. Then if we take that bucket and pour it into a small measuring cup, we'll lose even more. The more we compress a file, the more we lose. So if I take AVC HD, which is a small file, and pour it into ProRes, which is a bigger codec, we retain all the quality. But if I take a ProRes file and pour it down into a smaller file, like H.264, we're throwing away data. Our goal is to preserve as much data as we can while at the same time making the file as small as possible. Which brings me to compression rule number 2. The higher the quality of the source file, the higher the potential quality of the compressed files derived from it. You can't make a compressed file look better than the source file. There's only one exception to this, and that's when you're making the frame size smaller. I discovered this myself several years ago when I had a shot which is somewhat out of focus. The smaller I made the frame size, the more in focus the shot became, just by the nature of how reducing the frame size works. Which brings me to compression rule number 3. When compressing a file, you apply settings to determine what you want the source file to become. The size and format of the source file have almost no relevance. If it's a 10 gig source file, a 50 gig, a 200 gig, it doesn't make any difference how big or what the codec of the source file is. You're specifying what you want it to become. All compression software automatically determines the specs of the source file and creates the transcoded file based on your settings. Now, this seems counterintuitive, but our job as compressionists is to focus on what we want the source file to become. A couple definitions before we get too carried away. The first is codec, the second is bitrate. Codec, which is a contraction of compressor-decompressor, is the mathematics used to convert light and sound into numbers that can be stored and played back from a computer. Codecs are the heart and soul of compression. There's no single codec that is perfect for capture and editing and distribution. We're now in a 3-codec world. We shoot one codec, we edit a second codec, and we distribute a third codec. While codecs convert real life, which is infinite in all dimensions, into something that computers can store, which is just a series of ones and zeros. Bitrate is what we are principally concerned about when it comes to compression. Bitrate is the speed in bits per second, abbreviated BPS, of a media file during playback. Controlling bitrate is a key element of compression. Bitrate, by the way, is also called data rate or bandwidth, and this determines also how smoothly a web video will stream. For instance, if you have a 1 megabit per second connection to the internet, and you're streaming a file which requires 2 megabits per second, that file's going to stop and start and stop and start because the file bitrate needs more bandwidth than your internet connection supports. Trying to figure out what's the best bitrate to compress at to support most of your users is a never-ending puzzle which we are always trying to solve. File size is the size in megabytes of a media file, and file size is totally dependent upon bitrate. Low bit rates yield smaller files. High bit rates yield larger files. Smaller files download and play faster. Our goal when creating videos for the web is to get the highest possible image quality from the smallest possible bitrate. Frame size is the size in pixels of a video frame. As you know, there are two common sizes, 1920 by 1080 and 1280 by 720. Frame rate is the number of frames playing per second. While video supports very specific frame rates, the web will support an infinite variety of frame rates, and we can take advantage of this to reduce file sizes by changing our frame rates. Artifacts are what we're guarding against in compression. They're small, ugly, rectangular blocks in compressed video caused by bit rates that are set too low to support the frame size and the frame rate and the movement of the video that we're working with. Let me illustrate. The image on the left is a detail from a source file. The image in the center is a detail from a high bitrate but still compressed file. And the image on the right is from a low bitrate compressed file. Notice the detail, the smoothness of the edges, the clarity of the color of the image on the left. And we're getting close to that with the image in the center, though the eye and the iris of the eye doesn't have quite the same level of clarity. And we're starting to see some smearing in the curving lines around the head of the Chinese dragon in the picture in the middle. But the picture on the right has way too low a bit rate. Look at how stair-steppy and blocky the edges of the white with the black background are. Look at how we've lost all the detail in the eye, all the detail of the swirling stitching of the red in the face of the Chinese dragon. Artifacts, which are always rectangular blocks, are caused by a compression bit rate that is too slow to properly display the compressed movie. So you ask, what determines quality? Image quality is a balance of 5 factors: codec, compressed frame size, compressed frame rate, the amount of movement between frames, and the bit rate of the compressed file. Different codecs require different settings for similar quality. For instance, MPEG-2 requires twice the bit rate of MPEG-4 to achieve the same quality. Compressed frame sizes mean the larger the frame size, the faster the bit rate needs to be. The smaller the frame size, the slower the bit rate can be. Faster frame rates also require faster bit rates. A 30 frames a second video requires a faster frame rate than a 10 frame a second video. The amount of movement between frames also has an impact. If you have a lockdown camera shooting a person sitting in a chair and only their mouth is moving, we can compress that very, very small. If, on the other hand, I have a handheld camera shooting a dance recital, there's a lot of movement between every pixel and between every frame, which means that I have to have a faster bit rate to be able to support all that movement before artifacts creep in. Bit rate of the compressed file, the higher the bit rate, the higher the quality, but the larger the file size. But bit rate isn't everything. Files encoded at the same bit rate will generally have the same file size, but they may not have the same image quality unless they also have the same compression specifications. Again, let me illustrate. Here's two images. The image on the left was compressed at 750 kbits per second. The image on the right was also compressed at 750 kbits per second, but the image on the left is only 480 by 270. Look at the hair detail, all the clarity in the skin, the smoothness of the edges where the skin is in front of the background. The image on the right was a 1920 by 1080 image. Look at how blocky it is. The faces are not just pixelated, but they're posterized. We don't have any kind of smooth skin tone. The edges have got stair-stepping. The hair detail is lost. The same movie compressed at the same bit rate, but output to two different frame sizes yields two different results. The one on the left is fine. The one on the right is a mess. Frame size makes a difference, because bit rates that work for one frame size don't work for others. An NTSC DV frame contains 345,600 pixels. PAL is close at 414,000. But a 720p frame is 3 times the size of an NTSC frame. A 1080p is 7 times the size of an NTSC frame. If we move to 2K at 2 million or 4K at 8 million pixels, there's no way the same bit rate that works perfectly for 300,000 for NTSC is going to begin to equal what we need for 4K at 8 million pixels. Our bit rate has to change as our file size changes. I mentioned that movement is an issue. Video compression yields the smallest file sizes when there is very little movement between frames. The more movement between frames in a master file from, say, a handheld camera, transitions, effects, or talent, the higher the bit rate that's needed to properly compress it. If small file sizes are key, minimize on-screen movement. Don't use a handheld camera. Avoid using film noise effects. Remove video noise caused by low light, or don't put your talent in front of a background where leaves are waving. The more you minimize movement, the smaller you can make the file. A few more definitions before we wrap up. iframe is a method of compression where each frame is compressed individually. This yields excellent image quality, but creates very large file sizes. This is the best format for editing. Digibeta, DV, ProRes are all iframe-based codecs. GOP, which stands for Group of Pictures, is a method of compressing where groups of frames are compressed together. This yields good image quality with very small file sizes, but there are some problems editing group of pictures because of the way that the GOP is actually structured. This is best used for web videos. So iframes give us the highest quality. GOP gives us the smallest file size. When we move to compressor, there's several terms that I'm going to use I want to define before we switch to the application. There's compression setting, job action, destination, and compression group. A compression setting are the specifications that determine how a source file is to be compressed. A job action is an automated task that runs when the compression is complete. A destination is a setting that combines both a compression setting and a job action. Classic example is compressing for YouTube. We have to compress the file to YouTube specs, then we have to transfer it to YouTube. A compression group is a fancy name for a folder that contains multiple settings. This has been an excerpt of a recent Power Up webinar taking a look at the new features inside Compressor 4.1. For the complete version of this online training, please visit our store at larryjordan.biz/store and look for Webinar 116. By the way, membership is a great way to stretch your training dollars. A subscription membership to our video training library saves you money. You can access all our videos for a low monthly price of only $19.99. That's more than 700 movies, dozens of hours of training, all in-depth and all up-to-date. Plus, members can attend any of our Power Up webinars for free. Our training covers Apple and Adobe software. We update it every week, and for more information, visit larryjordan.biz/subscriptions.